Silent Hill as a series has always thrived on atmosphere. It's never been about fast-paced action or cinematic spectacle in the way other horror games try to reinvent themselves. What makes Silent Hill terrifying is how it creeps under your skin and refuses to leave. It's the way environments feel alive, how the world twists your sense of familiarity into something unfamiliar, and how silence itself can be more terrifying than any monster. And in that regard, SilentHillF is one of the most powerful entries in the franchise. It chooses not to return us to the foggy streets of the iconic American town, but instead relocates us to an entirely new cultural and architectural space, the 1960s Japan. This was a bold move, and in many ways it was a necessary one. By leaving behind the rusted hospitals and decayed suburbs we've come to expect, SilentHillF reminds us that horror is not limited to a single location. Horror is something that can be transplanted, reimagined, and reborn in a new cultural context. And in doing so, the franchise feels both alien and familiar. But while the atmosphere of SilentHillF may be one of the most unsettling in the series, its combat systems drag the experience into frustration. Like stamina management, weapon durability, and sluggish animations create a sense not of tension, but of tedium. And in this way, the game echoes some of the weakest moments from past entries like Silent Hill Downpour and Silent Hill Homecoming. What should feel like desperate survival instead feels like a mechanical chore. So in this analysis, I want to explore two sides of SilentHillF: the brilliance of its atmosphere and environment, and the disappointment of its combat. By the end, it becomes clear that SilentHillF is both one of the most haunting entries in the franchise and one of the most frustrating. The first thing that strikes you about SilentHillF is how alien the setting feels compared to previous games. Instead of crumbling apartment complexes or abandoned hospitals, you find yourself in wooden corridors, quiet shrines, and the decaying remains of rural Japanese architecture. The game uses these settings not just as background scenery, but as living participants in the horror. Japanese architecture is fundamentally different from Western design, and this difference works to the game's advantage, like narrow wooden hallways like creaks underfoot, sliding shoji doors become fragile barriers between safety and terror, and tatami mats that absorbs sound in a way that makes footsteps feel muted and ominous. Even something as simple as the sound of a door sliding open becomes uncanny, because it's a sound most players don't associate with Silent Hill. This cultural shift makes the game more unsettling, precisely because it's unfamiliar. In earlier Silent Hill titles, players could relate to the environments: hospitals, schools, malls. These were ordinary places warped into nightmares. But in SilentHillF, the very architecture already feels alien to Western audiences, and the developers use that distance to create discomfort before the horror even begins. The gardens and shrines are especially effective in this regard. Traditional Japanese gardens are often designed to be serene, places of beauty and reflection, but here they're overgrown, crawling with fungal growths, and suffused with silence. What should be peaceful instead becomes suffocating, as if the natural world itself has turned hostile. Even the stillness of the air feels weaponized. Lightning also plays a major role in building atmosphere. Flickering lanterns create shadows that feel alive, and corridors are often bathed in dim light that blurs the edges of the world. This visual language communicates one thing: you are not meant to feel safe anywhere. Unlike the harsh industrial lighting of earlier games, SilentHillF uses soft illumination to lure you into a false sense of security. only to let the shadows hide something watching you. What makes all of this that I mentioned effective is how it reinforces the core philosophy of Silent Hill. The real horror comes from existing in the world itself. You don't need jump scares when the environment is oppressive enough that simply walking forward feels dangerous. SilentHillF understands this in its bones. The architecture, the gardens, the shrines, all of it feels hostile in its silence, alive in its decay. And this is why the atmosphere in SilentHillF works so well. It captures what Silent Hill has always been about, the sense that the world itself is conspiring against you, that every corner hides a threat, and that safety is an illusion. It is in many ways one of the creepiest environments the series has ever delivered. For all the brilliance of SilentHillF's atmosphere, the moment you're forced to engage in combat, the illusion starts to crumble. Combat has always been a fragile aspect of the Silent Hill formula, clunky enough to create vulnerability, but not so broken that it pushes the player into outright frustration. It's a fine line, and unfortunately, SilentHillF falls on the wrong side of it. From the very first encounter, combat feels slow and exhausting. Weapons do not carry weight in a satisfying sense, but in a sense of dragging a stone across the floor. Every swing is sluggish, every strike delayed by an animation that makes you feel disconnected from your actions. The intent, perhaps, was to heighten the sense of struggle, to remind players that they are not professional fighters, but ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. This design philosophy has merit, but here it collapses under its own weight. When combat feels this sluggish, it doesn't create tension. No, it creates irritation. Instead of feeling desperate, you feel cheated. Enemies don't terrify you because of their design, but because engaging them means wrestling with the system that resists you at every turn. Horror thrives on making players feel vulnerable, but SilentHillF confuses vulnerability with tedium. And then there is the stamina system. In theory, stamina could add a layer of strategy, forcing you to manage resources carefully, deciding when to fight and when to flee. But in execution, stamina drains so quickly that even the act of swinging a weapon feels costly. Combine this with the speed of the animations, and the result is a combat system that punishes you not for mistakes, no, but simply for trying to engage. Weapon durability only worsens the problem. Weapons degrade far too quickly, like breaking just as you begin to adapt to their timing. What should feel like desperate improvisation instead feels like the game forcing you into constant inconvenience. Rather than weighing risk versus reward, combat becomes a chore you actively avoid. The system doesn't make you feel like a survivor. It makes you feel like you're being penalized for even trying to participate. And the net result is that very quickly, players realize combat isn't worth their time. Running past enemies becomes the preferred strategy, not because it feels frightening, but because it feels efficient. This breaks one of the core emotional beats of Silent Hill. You're supposed to fear what lurks in the shadows, not sigh in relief because you won't have to stop and swing your weapon 5 times just to break it in the process. And also, animation play a significant role in this failure. Every swing is slow, every block delayed, every attack telegraphed with just enough awkwardness to make it feel unresponsive. Instead of capturing the panic of survival, the animations lock you into motions that remove agency. In horror, losing control can be powerful, but only when it feels like the loss of control belongs to the character. not the game engine. Here, the sluggishness makes it clear that the limitation is mechanical, not psychological. Combat in Silent Hill F is not terrifying, it's exhausting. And exhaustion is not the same as fear. True horror arises when the player feels trapped, overwhelmed, and powerless, not when they feel like they are fighting against a poorly designed system. The difference may seem subtle, but it's crucial. In the moments where I should have been dreading the approach of an enemy, I was instead dreading the idea of having to interact with the combat mechanics at all. And this undermines the game's pacing in a profound way. Silent Hill works best when combat punctuates exploration, when moments of violence feel like spikes of chaos in the slow burn of dread. But in F, combat is so unappealing that it removes the rhythm entirely. Instead of fearing combat encounters, I was planning how to avoid them altogether. And while avoidance is certainly part of survival horror, it should never feel like the optimal way to engage with the game. To summarize everything I have said, basically what I mean is the atmosphere sets the stage for horror, but the combat systems fail to support it. When talking about combat in Silent Hill F, it's impossible not to think about the series' past attempts to refine or reinvent the same system. This is not the first time Silent Hill has tried to balance atmosphere with clunky, weighty combat. And unfortunately, F repeats the same mistakes that were already heavily criticized in earlier entries. The clearest point of comparison is Silent Hill Downpour. Downpour attempted to ground combat by making the protagonist, Murphy, feel like an ordinary man rather than a trained fighter. On paper, this was the right direction. Silent Hill has always been more powerful when its characters are fragile, when every encounter feels like a struggle. But Downpour stumbled because of how it executed that philosophy. Weapons broke far too quickly, and stamina drained so fast that fighting more than one enemy at a time was frustrating rather than frightening. The intention was to force improvisation, to make players scavenge and adapt. The reality was that combat felt sluggish, repetitive, and punitive. Silent Hill F inherits all of those flaws almost wholesale. Weapons once again feel disposable, not in a way that builds tension, but in a way that feels like a punishment. The stamina system once again collapses under its own weight, draining so quickly that combat becomes an obligation instead of an option. If Downpour was criticized for making combat a burden, Silent Hill F doubles down on their mistakes rather than correcting it. Then of course there's Silent Hill Homecoming. Homecoming represents the other extreme. Where Downpour and F leaned into sluggishness and fragility, Homecoming tried to modernize Silent Hill by giving its protagonist, Alex, a more combat-oriented moveset. He could dodge, counter, and wield weapons with relative efficiency. On the surface, this made combat more responsive and dynamic, but it came at a cost. The sense of vulnerability is gone. Players often felt more like they were in an action horror game rather than a survival horror one. Silent Hill's atmosphere of helplessness was replaced by mechanics that encouraged aggression. The result was an identity crisis. It was smoother, yeah, but it no longer felt like Silent Hill. So if you compare them side by side, these three games represent two extremes of a failed design spectrum. Homecoming sacrificed tension for responsiveness, and Downpour sacrificed playability for atmosphere. Silent Hill F, rather than finding a balance between the two, lands firmly in Downpour's territory. It embraces the fragility, but without making that fragility meaningful. You don't feel like a vulnerable survivor scraping by against impossible odds. You feel like a player trapped in a system that doesn't want to be engaged with. And this becomes especially frustrating because by 2025, these lessons should have been learned. Players have been voicing their frustrations about Silent Hill combat for years now, and yet F repeats those exact missteps. The tragedy here is that the atmosphere and setting are some of the strongest in the franchise. The architecture, the sound design, the creeping dread, all of it works beautifully. But when the time comes to swing a weapon, the spell is broken. You are no longer immersed in the world, you are simply reminded that you are playing a game, and that the game's systems are in your way. If Downpour felt like the first misstep in trying to modernize combat, and Homecoming felt like the opposite overcorrection, then Silent Hill F feels like a refusal to move forward at all. It chooses to cling to the clumsy weight of Downpour's combat, doubling down on frustration rather than evolving towards something that could capture both vulnerability and playability. One of the recurring problems across the entire Silent Hill franchise is the question of combat. What should it feel like? Should it be deliberately clunky, emphasizing vulnerability and fear? Or should it be smoother, more responsive, aligning with the expectations of modern audiences who are by now used to polished action systems? Silent Hill F sits directly in the middle of this identity crisis, and in doing so, it exposes the tension that has haunted the series for decades. The original trilogy, Silent Hill 1, 2, and 3, handled combat in a way that was functional but secondary. The clumsiness was there by design. You weren't supposed to feel like a skilled fighter. You were supposed to feel like an ordinary person, someone you can see down the street, someone for whom every swing of a pipe or every shot from a handgun was desperate and unpracticed. Combat worked because it was simple. You didn't spend time micromanaging stamina bars or worrying about weapon health. You simply picked up what you could and tried to survive. Where older games succeeded was in understanding that combat was not the centerpiece of the experience. No, exploration, atmosphere, and psychological tension were the heart of Silent Hill. Combat was a punctuation mark, a spike of adrenaline that reminded you of the dangers lurking in the fog. It was never meant to be polished, but it also wasn't meant to consume the player's attention. Starting with Silent Hill Homecoming and Silent Hill Downpour, the series began experimenting with making combat more of a focal point. Homecoming leaned toward an action horror identity, and Downpour leaned in the opposite direction. Neither approach truly worked, and both highlighted the same fundamental problem. When you make combat a central pillar of the design, it begins to expose the cracks in the Silent Hill's formula. Silent Hill F continues this struggle. Instead of finding a balance, it doubles down on the weaknesses. It tries to make every fight feel meaningful, but the result is the opposite. Players don't feel like they're making desperate choices. They feel like they're trapped in busy work. Combat doesn't reinforce the horror, it distracts from it. And this is where the identity crisis becomes clearest. What is Silent Hill supposed to be? A psychological horror series about dread and atmosphere, or a survival horror series about managing scarce resources in combat? Ideally, it could be both. But Silent Hill F shows us what happens when the scales tip too far towards systems that punish without rewarding. The atmosphere says one thing, that you're lost in a world of nightmare, suffocated by dread. But the mechanics say another, that you should avoid engaging altogether because combat isn't worth the trouble. The tragedy of this design is that it creates a dissonance between what you feel and what you do. Atmosphere draws you in, immerses you, convinces you that you are inhabiting this nightmare. But the second combat begins, that immersion fractures. You are pulled out of the world, forced to think not about the creeping horrors of the environment, but about how long your stamina bar will last, or how many swings it will take before your weapon breaks. Fear is replaced by calculation, and calculation kills horror. When I step back and look at Silent Hill F as a whole, what emerges is a paradox. On one hand, it is one of the most visually and atmospherically accomplished entries in the entire franchise. The use of Japanese architecture, the eerie silence of overgrown gardens, the fragile walls of wooden corridors, the creaking of ancient shrines, all of these elements combine to create a space that feels more alive, more suffocating, and more unsettling than almost anything we've seen so far from Silent Hill. And in terms of atmosphere, F understands what makes horror terrifying. It's not just monsters, not just blood, but the feeling that the very world around you wants you gone. On the other hand, that brilliance is undercut by the very thing that should elevate the tension: combat. Instead of supporting the atmosphere, combat works against it. The slow animation, the draining stamina, the fragile weapons, they don't make you feel like a desperate survivor, they make you feel like a frustrated player. The design does not amplify the horror, it interrupts it. Where the world whispers, "Be afraid," the mechanics mutter, "Don't bother." The result is a fractured experience. Exploration is breathtaking and suffocating all at once, a triumph of horror design, but combat is exhausting in the wrong way. The kind of exhaustion that drains immersion rather than fueling dread. And this divide makes Silent Hill F both one of the strongest and weakest entries in the series. This is not a new mistake. Downpour already showed us how fragile weapons and clunky stamina systems could derail immersion. Homecoming showed us how leaning too far into responsive action could betray the series' core identity. Silent Hill F had the opportunity to learn from both extremes, to find balance, and yet it chooses instead to embrace the worst of Downpour and Homecoming without learning from its failures. What this reveals is something larger than just a single game. Silent Hill as a franchise has always struggled with combat, and F reminds us that this struggle is ongoing. The series is caught between two poles: atmosphere and mechanic, dread and playability. Too far in one direction and the player is left with tedium, too far in the other and the player is left with an action game that forgets its own soul. So where does that leave Silent Hill F? For me, it leaves it as one of the most haunting atmospheric experiences in modern horror, and also one of the most frustrating. It is a masterpiece of world design and mood, but a misstep in gameplay. It is both a reminder of why Silent Hill matters and a warning of how easily it can undermine itself. At the end of the day, when I think about Silent Hill F, I won't remember the sluggish swings of its weapons or the irritation of its stamina system. I will remember the silence of its shrines, the way the gardens felt alive with menace, the weight of walking through spaces that felt both real and wrong. And that is the greatest tragedy, because beneath the frustration of its combat lies one of the most terrifying worlds Silent Hill has ever created, a world that deserves better systems to support it.